Hello, everyone. Star Fuentes here again, this time to introduce our second panel Coronavirus News What to Believe, featuring Mount Sinai South NASA's Dr. Adi Sharma, Pew Research Center's Amy Mitchell, Bloomberg News' Reg Gale, and moderator, TV radio personality Rita Cosby. Good morning, Rita.
Hi, everybody, and I'm delighted to be here with the Fair Media Council talking about this very, very important and very, very timely topic. It's, of course, coronavirus news, what to believe. And boy, there's been so much information coming at all of us. So I'm so glad that the news conference, Real and Powerful, decided to pick this as a topic. I'm going to be your moderator for the hour. And as you just heard, we have a really, really great row of panelists. I want to get right to the questions because boy, is there a lot. And these folks have been on the front lines in different arenas. One is a journalist, one, of course, as a medical expert right there on the front lines as well, and somebody from the esteemed Pew Research Center watching what the media is reporting, fact from fiction. I want to start with Reg Gale. Reg from Bloomberg, you really have been on the front lines. I mean, you are a health and science reporter, and I know that you have just been involved in this. Would you ever, I want to kind of get from a personal perspective, because would you ever have imagined if somebody said to you maybe a year and a half ago, okay, we're going to have this virus that is going to consume the news and obviously consume our lives and be so deadly and so destructive and really just have such a devastating effect on the global economy. Would you ever have imagined that personally, as someone who's been following health and science? Did you ever imagine we'd be at that moment?
Well, I've been covering health and science for a long time, which means covering AIDS, covering Ebola, covering a number of different things. So it's not a surprise that this happened, but it really is a surprise at the width and breadth of what's happened, how it's affected our economy, how it's affected individual families. It really has kind of come along and overwhelmed every other part of life at this point in many different ways, including the presidential election, including how people are excuse me, my phone just went off.
See, that you're in demand.
Yeah,
Greg, you are in demand, even as we speak.
So that's been the surprise, is really how broad and how wide this the effects have been.
Yeah, it is amazing. I want to bring in Amy Mitchell with the Pew Research Center. Amy, did you ever imagine that it really would be consuming the news 24/7?
It's really been incredible to see the amount of attention that this pandemic has taken across the country. It's certainly one of the things we see is the degree to which the American public is paying close attention to it. And that began, back in early March and has remained remarkably high, with people paying much more attention to the virus and the news surrounding that than to the election up until we got, closer and closer to election day. So very high levels of interest. There's certainly, differences in where people are turning for that news and information. And I think that's something that we'll talk about, more as we get further into the panel. But it is an area that has consumed a large part of Americans' news diet over this last year.
And Amy, to that, you talked about sort of up to the election, post-election. How has the coverage been post-election? Is it still as consuming as someone who monitors that?
Well, we do find that people are still paying quite close attention to it. There has been a little bit of a decline, and that's as the attention to election news rose, and certainly the story and the news surrounding the election remained pretty center even in the weeks and month following the election itself, but still quite close attention to the virus itself.
What's been interesting, I work for a financial news service, Bloomberg, and in the past, financial stories are the ones that really led the hit counts for us, both on our terminal and on our website. But at this point, I mean, people are less interested in how Pfizer is doing financially, and much more interested in the vaccine and what it means.
And you hit a good point, Reg, because I think it has become so personal and it is so tangible. And just like you said, because it is such a serious topic and life or death, literally, as we have seen with now 400,000 people in America have sadly died. And I think that's why responsible journalism is important. But also, as you said, people really are tuning in because it is such an important issue to them, to their families, to their neighbors. I want to get to Dr. Sharma there because you are really there on the front lines when I think about at Mount Sinai, South Nassau. And you've been in so many of the different hospital systems through the years. So you have such great experience. I'm so glad you're with us, Dr. Sharma. Describe what it's been like for you and also for your team there, because it has been so consuming. Have you ever dealt with something like this? And your team too, and your professional career, which is very impressive.
Well, thank you, Rita. No, I would say that the closest would be a mass casualty incident, but those last a day, maybe 2 days. 9/11 was a good example of something where a huge disaster, the medical response was critical, but it was a very short-lived event. This has been like the movie Groundhog Day. Literally, we get up and we start over, and it's the same thing every day, over and over again. And it does wear you down. It does beat up the soul somewhat. And we do our best to keep our staff engaged and to keep them their spirits as high as possible, given everything that's going on. It's challenging, but we know we're doing good work and we're trying to get people back home to their families. So that's always encouraging.
And Dr. Sharma, I can't imagine what it's like for you. I think about, a broadcaster or journalist like myself, and Reg, all these details coming at us all the time. Reg certainly has a lot more experience in the health and science field than I do. But how do you, from a medical perspective, with all the new developments, because this is sort of new terrain and we see it even on the national scope. And when you sit there and you look, and one day we hear something from Dr. Fauci, another day we hear something else from the WHO, we almost don't know how to separate it. How do you deal with it from a medical profession? Because a lot of this is new terrain, even from people who are there right on the front lines.
It's very challenging. Certainly, there's many inputs that are coming towards us. And fortunately, within the healthcare arena, we have a number of experts that specialize in certain areas. So if it's an immunology question or an infectious disease question, we have people who spent their entire career in that space. And so much of it is filtered through them. And then we have conversations about where we think that the science is pointing. And we make decisions based on that. And then additionally, we have guidance from the CDC, and we rely heavily on that guidance for policymaking within the hospital, and also anything coming from the Department of Health, New York State Department of Health. So many things we're required to do, we don't have an option on, and other things that we do have an option on, we try to find the best science. And being part of Mount Sinai, that's a huge system where science is an important element of what they do. And so we also benefit from the scientific leaders at the mothership, so to speak.
Yeah, no, that is a good plus. Amy Mitchell, let me talk about the mothership for you, the Pew Research Center. One of the things, I saw a poll recently, and I thought this was really interesting. This was maybe a few months ago, but still very timely, I'm sure. And based on what you were saying just a moment ago, 7 out of 10 U.S. adults say that they kind of need to take a break from news coverage. Tell us about that and what that is. Is it just because it's just so consuming and it's such heavy news? What is that?
Yeah, that's certainly, part of what's likely to be behind this. I mean, it's not something that we probe to follow up and ask people about, but there's a sense of there's so much and it's coming at one all the time. And certainly also early on, in the earlier days and months of the outbreak, just constant updates in terms of, what to do, what we think we know about it, what we don't. And, one of the things we also saw early on was the impact of certain types of false claims that are coming out about it, and the degree to which the public became divided over their sense and their belief about this outbreak itself. It became quite political early, but also we saw quite a difference based on where people were turning, even within party, based on where people were turning for their news, something like the early claims about the origin of the virus itself and being created intentionally in a lab. There were certain parts of the population based on media diet as a part of their makeup that were much more likely to believe that the virus was created intentionally in a lab than others who felt it most likely came about naturally. So we started early on, even within people's information flow, quite a separation in terms of what people believed and didn't believe and what their attitudes about the severity of the virus were.
One of the things I thought was interesting also, Amy, was that sort of where different theories come about and different conspiracy theories, if you will, from a psychological perspective. And I was looking into this, particularly in the last few days, because you wonder, okay, where does this sort of come from? It's sort of a psychological mechanism, if you will, sometimes when something is so overwhelming to either sort of minimize it or attribute it to something else. Is that what you found in your research? I thought that was fascinating.
That's interesting. That's not something we, explored directly in our research. We certainly did look at the question of exposure. So there's your view about it and your belief, but there's also how much you've heard about different things. And that in and of itself too, one of the things was the pandemic video, this idea that it was created by powerful people. And those who primarily relied on social media for their news about the coronavirus were more likely to have even come across that, in the beginning than certain, people who turn to other types of platforms. So certainly exposure can be a part of that. We did not explore specifically the psychological elements that might be behind one's predilection to latch onto it.
And Dr. Sharma, to what Amy was just talking about, did you find that a lot of people were saying, okay, well, I saw this either on social media or I saw it on a blog or I saw it on that there was a lot of different information coming from, and sometimes, by the way, sometimes those sources turn out to be true. We see as journalists, years ago, it was always sort of the traditional places. Sometimes some of those things do turn out to be right. A lot of times you get all these, a lot of wild theories out there, as well. How confusing was that from you from the medical perspective?
Right. So for COVID itself, all of our patients who came in with COVID, they accepted that they had COVID, and it wasn't that difficult with them. But the vaccine, it did prove difficult when there were numerous pieces of misinformation out there. We've always known that diet was an important part of maintaining health, and it looks like media diet now has to be added to that repertoire for us, because if people are thinking that there's chips, microchips, or whatever, and they're not getting the vaccination, they're actually putting themselves in harm's way based on erroneous information, poor data sets, and we're finding that that's where our obstacle is. It's getting people to accept the vaccine as safe and that it's not been tampered with and there's no ulterior motives related to the vaccination.
How, let me get to Ray Gale, from sort of some of the different sources coming at you too. How consuming was it when you were getting information from all these different places as what to sort of put into your coverage, Reg, and what to decide to keep in and keep out, especially in the early days where there was such disparate information all over the place?
Yeah, sometimes some of the early stories like, what was it, hydroxychloroquine, we weren't sure. And as journalists, we can't say, well, that's not good or that is good, but
right,
there were
because
cautions.
You're obviously more experienced than the average person, but you're not a doctor, right?
Right, exactly. And so, we have to go to our sources and ask them. And in many cases, they're scientists or doctors like Dr. Sharma. And, there were concerns there right from the very beginning on that particular drug. And, we expressed out those concerns. It was sometimes difficult. I've gotten some incredible hate mail based on stories that we've written at Bloomberg on various aspects of the pandemic. But it's important for us as journalists with a little bit of background to know who to talk to, know who we can get to quickly, and who will give us the straight news.
Did you get a lot of different information, Reg, too? Because as you would see, even publicly, we would hear different information depending almost on different doctors. A lot of times, both reputable doctors, sometimes too, they just had different information because it was new terrain.
Yeah, it was new terrain, and some of the information was confusing at first,
Mhm.
and not as clear as it might be, but over time, and sometimes it corrected itself pretty quickly. You start to see a trend among, doctors you trust and scientists you trust, who will tell you, this is something we have to be really cautious on. The studies haven't been done yet, and we read the studies that have been done, and kind of take a look at them from our own experience, and we're able to say, you know what, it's not proven yet. It may be something we should look at, but it's not proven yet. And it's important to get that into stories early on. Sometimes people read past those lines, but it's important to get those stories early on, and to get that information into stories early on.
And Reg, obviously it's important, especially when you're dealing with stories like this. Health and science, which has been your beat and your expertise, and done so well, Reg, for so many years. It's always, I think, an important area, as we'll all attest, but especially when you're dealing with something like a deadly virus, a
Right.
pandemic. Did you feel the weight when you were doing stories of, I got to get this right, like even more so to be extra careful than you ever were before?
Um, well, I always try to be careful, but the important thing is really to get the information out there, and don't necessarily accept it from just one source. I mean, there are studies out there. There is data out there on all of this stuff. A lot of times it's initial data, and if you kind of brand it as initial data and explain clearly that we don't have a final decision on this yet, I think you're doing your job as a journalist.
Absolutely. And before I move on to the next ones or twos, I want to ask you, which story did you get the most hate mail on?
Actually, early on, it was the hydroxychloroquine story. Really presented a lot of it, but it's really been a real range of things that have kind of spurred responses like that from people who are just don't believe what they're reading, and I can't change their mind. I just, we always answer with a very polite answer, and read what they're saying just in case they are making a good point. But it's been difficult.
Yeah, I'm sure. Let me go to Amy at the Pew Research Center, Amy Mitchell. Amy, Reg just talked about this, and you touched upon this a moment ago, about the sort of politicization of the virus and the handling of it. And also now, as Dr. Sharma was talking about, also the vaccines. Are you surprised that it sort of became so political, and because it became such a central issue in a political way in the campaigns, and continues to this moment?
Well, we've certainly been seeing over the last several years, a divide, a partisan divide in views about the news media, partisan divides in where people are turning for their news, and views about a range of things. The degree of separation here on something that was a worldwide pandemic was pretty striking to see. I mean, it was pretty incredible, the differences. An important note to make, though, is that in many cases, it was more nuanced than just a political divide, because within party, we saw a lot of differences, more on the right than on the left, but a lot of differences based on where people were turning for their news. And that includes sort of your mix of more traditional type of outlets. And we look at this by the audience makeup. So whether they're turning to outlets that have only right, audiences that lean their way politically, or more mixed audiences, but also other types of sources. So Trump and the task force, the CDC and other public health officials turning to local news or national news outlets for your news. Whichever of those was your primary source, there were a lot of differences, even within party. And certainly we saw quite stark differences among Republicans based on those who said that Trump and the White House were major sources of news for them when it came to the coronavirus. And that was everything from types of things that they believe, like the potential susceptibility of young adults in terms of catching it, to just how well the US had controlled it and whether the number of deaths was actually accurate. So the range of divides here in what people believed or sensed about this pandemic was really, really dramatic.
One of the things, it was a Pew Research study, and Amy, I want to touch on this, is 61% what gave equal attention to national and local news. Tell us about that. And I thought that was interesting too, that people were really turning to sort of both sources, especially because they were trying to find out the big picture, but also to find out what's happening in their community, which makes so much sense.
Yeah, it's really interesting because it was very much both a national and local story at the same time, trying to get an understanding of it. But then it's what's going on in my town, in my city, in my zip code. Can I get to the hospital? Are there beds available? Where can I get a test? Do we have testing? Is my school going to open? It was all these range of things. And we asked about a whole range of different topic areas like that, both at the national and local level, with people paying very close attention to both of those. Now, we did see differences among the public in the level of attention they were paying. And one of the interesting things was along race and ethnicity. So Black Americans, Black adults in the US were paying much closer attention to most all of these subject areas, particularly things like the availability of testing, hospital access, unemployment relief, those types of things were at much higher levels of attention among the Black adult community than white here in the US.
And because many of them were obviously deeply affected by that, correct? I mean, because it was something that was so important in their own lives and unfortunately, as we've seen, disproportionately affected in many ways.
Yeah, again, I mean, our surveys don't dig and probe into the why as they ask those questions, but certainly there's other data that would, that shows the degree to which that community was affected in an outsized way.
I saw also, Amy, the Guardian newspaper over there, the British publication. This was interesting. And I'm sure all of you are not surprised by this. And I want to get your take, and then Dr. Sharma, I want to get your take after this. There was a study, and the Guardian did this, and it said that basically many people believed that the COVID-19 fatality rate had been exaggerated, but the number was staggering to me. In some places, first of all, in England, I think in UK it was 1 out of 5 in UK. In Nigeria, 60%. That's a staggering number. Amy, from some of the research, you touched upon that a moment ago, how high that rate was.
There were differences here too, in the sense that people, felt the reported numbers were higher or lower than they actually were. And again, political, partisan differences there, with those on the right more likely to sense that the number was lower than it was being reported, right? That the reported number was exaggerated and higher. We also saw a lot of areas of difference just in other types of things like that, in terms of exaggerating the risks, that the virus has been made too big of a deal, a bigger deal than it should be versus a smaller deal. Lots of differences there. Based on party as well as media diet, and then the sense of what the U.S. may or may not have been able to do to control this in a different way.
Dr. Sharma, what's your reaction when you hear this? And I'm sure that just complicates your job there at Mount Sinai South Nassau. To hear so many people, as Amy was talking about, where they had such doubt on the mortality rates, or it was the media inflating the numbers. How complicated and how much more challenging did that make your work and your team's work on the front lines?
Right. It's very discouraging, Rita, to hear that. Our staff put themselves in harm's way. We've had staff die from COVID, and they do this every day. And for them to read stories that people don't believe it's real, or to dismiss the seriousness of this issue, it is discouraging for everyone. I'll tell you that in the beginning, I could understand a little bit of it because we had localized pockets of large infection rates. So in New York, we were hit early, and it's possible that someone in Nigeria, where they didn't have a lot of activity in the beginning, would say this is nonsense because they're not seeing it. We had 3 tractor trailers outside to help us with fatality management. I've never in my career seen that. The last time I've seen anything like that, again, was 9/11, where they had to bring in all of these external morgues because of the number of recoveries that had occurred. But in hospital medicine, to see tractor trailers being used as external morgues, I've never seen that before. And it was demonstrative of the fatality rate and the rapidity with which these patients were expiring from the virus, and the challenges and the taxing it put on the downstream system of funeral homes and cemeteries, and how they were going to manage all of this influx of unfortunately dead people.
Were you astounded? As someone, it's just heartbreaking to hear these stories. Even though we've been hearing them now, sadly, for some time, but to hear of what you're talking about, the tractor trailers and those things, were you astounded? The disconnect, I guess, that there were still people who were going, oh, the media's inflating the number, and here you are just seeing this heartbreaking situation firsthand, Dr. Sharma.
Absolutely. Again, it was very discouraging. I understood people who were isolated from it may not have been touched by it, but it's surprising to hear people just ignore obvious facts. When you see outside a hospital that there's all these trailers parked outside, and the news is reporting that this is how they're doing fatality management, I don't know what people think. The assumption is that it's all lies. I don't understand, and it's frustrating for us because when people dismiss it, then they act dangerously. They put themselves and others in harm's way. And we're here trying every day to do our best, and we need the community to do their best. And it's sort of an unwritten agreement we have that we will be here for them, but they also have to do what's right for everyone else. And we become worried that people who are dismissive of it will end up causing more harm along the way.
For sure. How did you bridge that gap? What did you say to them? Hey, take a look outside. This is what did you say? Because I'm sure there were people who were saying, oh, is it really that bad? Or do I need to come to the hospital? What's going on? What did you do?
What we saw locally in New York was it affected so many people that it was hard not to believe it, because everybody knew somebody that had either had COVID or was hospitalized or even died. And as a result, what we saw in the spring was pretty much right after April, New York really got COVID under control. We got to the point in the summer where we had consistently less than 10 patients in the hospital, having peaked at 400 COVID patients at one time. And then we got to a point where we had 0 COVID patients in the hospital. So we knew that New Yorkers, at least locally in the area, New York metro area, were really responsive and accepting of what this pandemic meant. And they were extremely careful. And I think that showed in our numbers diminishing so quickly from the peak, that first peak.
Yeah, thank goodness that it has diminished a bit. Let me go to Reg. Reg, are you surprised how politicized this became? And as you talked about some of the hate mail on both sides, but the disconnect with some people who said, okay, well, I don't need to do this. I don't need to wear a mask. I don't need to do that. Reg, can you hear me? Hey, Reg. I think we lost Reg. Let me go to Amy. Amy, are you there?
I am.
Yeah, we'll get Reg back on. It's a live video feed. But Amy, let me ask you: are you surprised that there was such a disconnect? And one of the topics I just touched on was also mask wearing too, as well. That there did seem to be sort of different camps, and even as you point out, even within the camps, there were different variations of it.
I think there's 2 different things, as Dr. Sharma's talked about a little bit here too, and Rich, that, there was a lot of information. A lot of this was developing in real time, news and comments and, information and misinformation are streaming sort of constantly now. So there was kind of there were 2 different things happening at the same time. One was just confusion and trying to understand, right? What do we know about this? What do we not? What, how much have the scientists been able to gather in terms of data and understanding? What are we trying? So there's that, which is hard enough in and of itself, right? And then on top of that, however, here's where today we put on these streams of both misinformation, made up news and claims, and a political nature, a political drive to sort of minimize. And that in combination with the confusion of something as huge and massive and unfolding as this, can just leave, chaos in terms of understanding among the public, even among those who, are wanting to figure out what to do. There's so much that they come across. And one of the things, again, and not to dwell so much on social media, because there are a lot of differences that can appear in, based on where you're going for your news. And so it's really not, solely a social media thing. But one of the things we see in that group is that those who tend to rely most on social media are generally paying less attention to news generally. And that's not just the coronavirus, and their attention was high, but not as high as among other parts of the population. They tend to be less knowledgeable just about the kinds of things that are happening in the country and the world, to just keep up less closely with current events. They're less sure, so they express more uncertainty about their knowledge, so they know they're not paying that much attention. And so you have a population like that then's getting things coming through their feeds in a constant stream for weeks, and then months at a time. And you can certainly understand where that confusion would occur, even among those who really want to know the truth, let alone those who are, potentially separated into camps of beliefs that they bring to the table at the outset.
Yeah, great points. Do we have Reg with us now?
Yeah.
Reg, can you hear me?
Lost me for a minute there, but I'm back.
Okay, good. He's on the comeback. All right, Reg. I want to ask you the politicization and how divisive this issue became. And as you pointed out, you talked about sort of even the hate mail of this, how passionate people got really on both sides and on many sides. Even I was just talking about, and Amy was just talking about sort of even within the camps, people had sort of different feelings of where they got their news, whether it was social media or Bloomberg, variety of different avenues. Are you surprised how polarized it became?
Oh, absolutely. No question about it. I think that, once it shifted into a political argument rather than a scientific argument, I think the whole thing went off the rails for a while. I think that slowed us down in addressing some very important things that we needed to address. I mean, it's always kind of fascinated me that masks have become a political issue. It seems like such a simple solution, or part of the solution, to move forward, and you'd hear tremendous arguments about it. I'd hear arguments here. I live on Long Island, going into the store, and I've never quite understood that. It's like, this is my personal freedom. Well, you wear seatbelts. Government tells you to do that. There are a number of different things that are done for your personal safety and for the safety of people around you. And this was just one more. The fact that it became such a political football absolutely surprised me.
And
one of the other things that was interesting.
Oh, yeah, go ahead, Amy.
I was just going to add in that, one of the other things that we noticed, there were a number of questions that we asked multiple times, over the course of between March and today. And one of the things you saw, that where those views got, when they got set, things like, it being exaggerated, for example, those numbers didn't change. As people form their views, there was not a pullback really, particularly among, those that turned to certain types of sources for news, whether it was Trump or, outlets with right-leaning audiences or other, but those gaps didn't tend to soften as we gained more knowledge or we got further into and there were more deaths and, more hardship. Those views got set early in many cases and really didn't waver over the course of this.
Dr. Sharma, did you?
I'm
sorry. Go ahead.
That's interesting. Go ahead, Rick. But Amy, it's really interesting that they actually stayed there, right?
Yeah. And it was, we asked before election, after election, and even as more data is coming out and people just sort of got into their camps and formed their views, and we really didn't see much change in a number of the areas. Now there's certainly some, I'm sure, where there have been shifts, but in some of these straight out, kind of overall sense of the pandemic and its impact and its import, a lot of those remain pretty strong.
Ray, go ahead. Sorry, I did.
Yeah, I was
interrupt
going to
you.
ask Dr. Sharma. I mean, once people get hospitalized for COVID-19, was there arguments about what they should receive? Was there, a back and forth, or did that kind of convince people?
You mean in terms of being treated for COVID, that they were accepting
Yeah,
of the
being treated for
diagnosis?
COVID.
Yeah,
Yeah.
most, again, our population was very accepting of the diagnosis. We didn't have really any COVID deniers. We were fortunate. I have heard of that in other hospitals where people are simply, they're not accepting the diagnosis that they have COVID. They think it's some kind of conspiracy. We did not experience that here. So it was challenging when people make interesting choices in the communities around us and would basically disregard any recommendations to socially distance. That's where we saw our problems, is that there were large sections of the communities that had gatherings, had weddings, had other events, and had mass exposure events. And we ended up seeing huge surges of patients from those communities, many of whom passed because they were at risk and they didn't take the proper precautions, either because they didn't accept the risk or they felt that it was minimal in their section of the world. I don't know.
What about Dr. Sharma, to touch on what Reg was just saying about treatments? Because there were so many, especially early on,
Right.
there were so many different things coming at people saying, okay, try this, try that.
Right.
I know even in your community, what is it, 200 patients have been provided that's the monoclonal antibody infusion. That's the same thing that Trump received and some others have received.
Right.
But we were hearing so many different sort of treatments and different things. How confusing was that? Because one day you hear, okay, well, maybe that works, or some things worked with some people and didn't with others.
It was very hard, Rita, especially in the beginning. It's a great question. In the beginning, we had no information. And scientific people are basically, I would describe them as skeptical optimists, right? So they believe anything can be done, but they don't believe when somebody does it. So we really look at anything with a skewed eye, and we didn't have that opportunity. There were not a lot of published studies. Basically, we're getting anecdotal data from other countries that had gotten into the virus first because of geographic timing. And we, in the beginning, threw the kitchen sink at every patient because we didn't know what would or wouldn't work. And we didn't want to deny anybody an opportunity of something that might provide them some benefit. So literally everyone was getting anything that came out. We were basically giving vitamin C, give them vitamin C, remdesivir, give them remdesivir. It was very challenging. We have significantly more information, more data is available now that allow us to make scientific application of these treatments. And what we've seen is the mortality rate has really lowered significantly with relative to the spring, where we were seeing such high fatalities. We're not seeing that now. And that's largely because we've been able to streamline what we treat patients with. Certain things like hydroxychloroquine, which Greg mentioned earlier, I think it was harmful. We gave it, we didn't know, we gave it everything our best shot. But I think we harmed patients with that. And at the end, there was probably going to be some evidence that some of the mortality was related to the side effects of these treatments. So we won't know, but we do know now that we're doing a much better job. The monoclonal antibody is a great example. We do the infusions on outpatients. We didn't have this opportunity in the spring. And so none of those patients, those 200 you mentioned, Rita, none of them had been admitted to the hospital. So, and they're all high-risk patients. They have to be high risk to qualify. So it speaks volumes of that therapy being beneficial. So it was confusing. It's much clearer now. And I think as we move forward, we'll have even more clarity with regards to therapeutic options.
How confusing, I want to touch on the mask issue too with you, Dr. Sharma, because at first, even Dr. Fauci was saying, there was words, maybe wear a mask, maybe not wear a mask. He kind of said later, well, maybe don't wear a mask because they wanted to keep the supply. There was such an issue with supply shortage, remember early on? And he wanted to make sure that those on the front lines had it because everybody was trying to make sure to get it. And of course, we want our doctors and first responders to have it because they're treating those folks on the front line. But how confusing was that? And then as more information came out, it was like, okay, good, we should all be wearing a mask. I mean, it does make common sense. I'm one of those people, by the way. As soon as I sort of heard it, I'd rather be overly cautious. I started to wear a mask, I think it was in March at some point. And a lot of people around me were not wearing it, but I always felt that I'd rather be safe than sorry. I'm glad I did. But how do you relay that message when there was so much? Was that a big battle that you had to, even just on a self, self-reliance, and also what everybody can do in their own individual lives to do their part?
Absolutely. I think that created a lot of confusion because we had different messages depending on the day of the week. And so some of it is if we rely on the media and as a source of information that's reliable, that reliability becomes questioned when the information changes from day to day. And I think in the beginning, I remember we were doing a Facebook Live for our patients, and I was with our chief of infectious disease, and they asked us about mask wearing, and we were split. I said my opinion was, and this was early on before COVID was really even in the U.S. My opinion was that in other countries, because it's culturally appropriate to wear masks, people wear masks, and we've seen this way before the pandemic. In many Asian countries, people wear masks if they're not feeling well. They wear masks because of air quality. There's a whole host of reasons why people wear masks. So it's widely accepted there. In the US, it's frowned upon. People wearing a mask, walking around prior to the pandemic, people would give them a little bit of a side glance. What's going on there, right? So that was hard. And our infectious disease chief said, don't wear a mask. And what I basically said is wear a mask if you don't feel well or if you're not sure. And then that information changed drastically overnight to everybody should wear a mask. And so it becomes challenging for people how to process that data. For the most part, again, we had pretty wide acceptance. I'm on Long Island too. I'm in Nassau. I don't know, Reg, what happened where you are, but I saw a mask everywhere that I went in the beginning, and I didn't really see a lot of people fighting with store owners. But that's not to say it was 100%. But I would say very, very high, 99, 98%. And that's just my opinion on the math. But we didn't see a lot of issues with masks. And even in coming to the hospital, people were very respectful of what was expected of them. But Rita, to your point, it is very confusing when you say one thing and then switch it to another, especially from a high authority like Dr. Fauci.
Although science is a living thing. I mean, it changes day by day. And I'm not defending Fauci or opposing him at this point, to be honest with you. But if you look at it in context to the time periods that things went through, you can see how his opinion may change, our news coverage may change, and also how you treat people change, because it really is a living thing. And when we have something like this, which we've never seen this type of virus before, well, actually we did in 1915, but where, this is a new thing kind of hitting on us all at once, it takes a while for things to kind of catch up and get to the point where we're feeling confident about this fact and confident about that fact. And, we're still not totally confident on the vaccines. There's still a lot of questions out there, but they're the best available fact with the most available data we have right now. And that's why they're being so well supported.
And
I
Reg,
And I think one of the challenges that
where you saw the whiplash, Reg, have you experienced that where like things were coming at you? Amy, I'll get you in a second. Sorry, Amy. But where there was such, as you're talking about, so much information coming, and as you talk about this sort of living, breathing thing, but this really, we saw, the whole nation saw it sort of, before our eyes, between, different people on the task force, different people, just because that it was evolving, in fairness to everybody, the information was evolving. Did you see that, Reagan, the reporting to that it was just so much coming out? And have you ever experienced a story like that?
Really, I haven't, to be honest. We, in the past, I've covered AIDS and Ebola and, some of the other SARS viruses, but not. This has been a totally unique experience in covering this. It's so much information is coming out every day from so many different areas that, I've been covering this since, I don't know, 1980. I've been doing reporting on science stuff, but it's
When you
a
were
whole
2
new
years
field.
old, right, Reg? You were
Yeah,
2
right,
at that.
right, exactly. Or maybe
Amy,
younger.
go ahead. Exactly. Amy, go ahead. Sorry to interrupt you.
No, not at all. And I would be interested in Regis in your thoughts on this. I mean, one of the things I think that again is added to the dynamic, I mean, the complexity of the situation, the rate at which it was exploding, the different kinds of information, as you say, that you're trying to get a handle on and learn about and be able to deliver to the public, right? And that's the goal, is to get what one can to the public to create the best sense of knowledge as possible. And when you add to that complexity, it's one thing if everybody's kind of in that same space, working together, trying to get the best information as possible, helping each other out, trying to get things out, versus adding in the political dimension of rejection of the virus itself, or wanting to downplay or reject or hold somebody to the fire if some piece of information changed, right? As opposed to saying, there were new developments, we're now learning X. I'm curious how much that added to the challenge of being able to report things out in a way that the public trusted it. When you have the political nature that got put on top of this virus very early on, really, pretty much from the beginning in terms of divides there.
I will tell you one thing. There were more discussions on individual stories in the newsroom among editors and reporters than I've ever been involved with on each of these stories, particularly early on when we weren't sure exactly who the best sources were. Although, I've worked with infectious disease doctors for years, but you still, even the infectious disease doctors, as Dr. Sharma said, they're just coming at it fresh and trying to figure out themselves. So a lot of these stories prompted some very deep conversations. The president's stand on this, and the fact that we were getting some early on hate mail, all of this required a good kind of talk through as we built and developed each of these stories.
Yeah, for sure. Dr. Sharma, let me bring you in on vaccines too. And we just have we have a few minutes left here, but I think it's really important because that is something that everybody is so focused on. And yet, there is obviously, again, as we're talking with our topic here, there seems to be a lot of sort of misinformation, misconceptions. There are some people who say they don't want to take it. There's reports of supplies where obviously we need more supplies. Certainly we want to get more out there to the general public, particularly here in America. But also there are reports too where a lot of people are saying, no, they don't want to take it. What do you see as the biggest misconception right now, Dr. Sharma?
So I think there's three components to that. I think for young women, there's a huge concern regarding fertility and reproductive issues. So whatever information they've read, it seems to suggest that it interferes with getting pregnant. That all of that is misinformed. Information related to inability to conceive, that's incorrect. Information related to harming a woman while she's pregnant or the unborn child, that's incorrect. So all the data that we have on this really demonstrates safety. We know that pregnant women are twice as likely to die from COVID than non-pregnant women. So why would you not want to be vaccinated if you're doing family planning? The second element is there are people who think that there's been some bizarre modifications to the vaccine, whether that's a microchip or anything else. There's that group of conspiracy theorists. They're a small group, but I don't understand why they hang on to these beliefs. That there's something I can't even imagine the science behind putting a invisible microchip with its own power source into the 0.3 mLs of vaccine that we're giving people. I don't even understand that. And then the final group are people who don't trust the process. So we realize that this is the fastest a vaccine has ever gotten into production. And so they feel there are shortcuts or something. What they don't recognize is we've never put this much effort into vaccine development ever, right? We've had every single pharmaceutical company on the planet working on vaccine development. We had everything else stopped in terms of all other activities, and the ability to recruit people for these initial tests. They've never had this ability. Everybody volunteered. We got 60,000 people volunteering for vaccine trials that never would have existed before. It takes forever to normally do these trials. So while things were compressed, there were pretty much no shortcuts taken. And the FDA did review everything as appropriately with an independent body. So, but people do think that that compressed timeline suggests that there's concerns for them, specifically with safety.
how do you overcome that? And actually, I should ask you a question. There are reports, of course, about allergies in certain people. How do you overcome some people who are concerned legitimately, or some who are misinterpreting news reports that they shouldn't, have it, depending on where the source is, as we're going. So we're talking about with Amy, if it's a fringe source as opposed to a mainstream source like what Reg's doing.
Right. Unfortunately, we have the experience now, millions and millions of doses being given out. And so we know the allergic response is right around 1 in 100,000. So very, very unlikely that any one individual is going to have a response. People who have the response have a background that would be suggestive that they're likely to have a response. And so in those individuals, we set up a separate team to help support that vaccination, so that if something does happen, we have a number of people available for that issue. For the vast majority of people, we've seen nothing. We've given out in the Sinai system tens of thousands of doses to healthcare workers and otherwise qualified people. I think we're at 60 to 70,000 at this point. We're really seeing just a small handful of adverse responses. And for the most part, people are getting the exact response we expect to see after any vaccination, whether it's the flu shot or tetanus shot or any other shot anyone's gotten their entire life. This is what we're seeing: a little bit of pain at the site of the vaccination, maybe a little bit of aches and pains the next day, and then all those symptoms are gone. And the upside, they're protected from COVID after that. So I think the trade-off is well worth it.
Good to know. Amy Mitchell from the Pew Center, what are the lessons learned from the covers that we've seen, and what do you think sort of are the precautions going forward for the media in particular?
Well, I think, we certainly look a lot at it from the public's perspective. So sort of, where is the American public in terms of their understanding, their sensibility, their exposure and knowledge about different parts of the storyline. And, certainly what we see here is that there are, quite large differences in everything from what people are even hearing, so sort of the lines of the stories that people are being exposed to, what their sensibility of it is, what their knowledge, so it's what facts that they actually know in terms of, what's the current unemployment rate, or what's the, what's the death count, in the range of at this point in time. But a lot of differences in what people have been exposed to or know or think about this pandemic that's tied to where they're turning for their news and information. And so that is a critical part of being able to be an informed part of this country and a part of this system, is being thoughtful about where you're going for your news. And then also, certainly being open to what it is that you're hearing. And, that's a big part of it too. When we ask people about made up news, Americans express quite a lot of concern about it. Most say they've come across it related, and also related to the coronavirus. But when you ask them to name something, to write in something that they say is made up news, what people write in runs the gamut of everything from, some truly made up claims to, political things like, everything that comes out of, Pelosi's mouth, or, the fact that it's hit my state, or, these other types of things. And so we're in a challenging time in terms of being able to create, a consensus of truth and information around a lot of news, and then certainly around something as, dramatic and critical in our country and our world as this.
Absolutely. Reg, let me go to you. What do you think the lessons are learned, and as we move forward now too?
Well, moving forward, I think it's important for people to realize that this story isn't going to end anytime soon. I think that there is a general feeling among the population that, by summer, everybody's going to be vaccinated. Everything's going to be hunky dory. But I think the reality of the situation is that this thing is going to run through the year, and it could run for years and years. We've already seen 3 very worrisome variants that have appeared, and yesterday and today. Yesterday, Moderna said they're starting to do a study on a booster shot, and the Moderna chief executive said, we don't know how long we're going to, our vaccines are going to lead to immunity. We want to be able to have a booster shot if it's needed. And we want to have a booster shot that will address the variants that we see developing now. And Pfizer said the same thing today. They're beginning studies on a booster shot. Over the long run, we may end up just like with influenza, having a shot every year just to get rid of this thing. But it's going to be a while before it's out of the news and before it's affecting it, and it stops affecting people's lives.
Wow, that's interesting to hear, Reg. Let me go to Dr. Sharma. You just heard what Reg was saying, and you're there also obviously on the front lines with emergency care and so forth there. Talk about, do you think that this will be a story that we'll be talking about for so long? And also, you know, with all the different variants that Reg was touching on, I mean, there's the one in the UK, there's one obviously coming out of South Africa. We're hearing about it all over the different places. Do you think this will be with us like influenza? Is that where we're headed to?
It's possible. I think that we will definitely be living with coronavirus for at least the next 2 years, so well into 2022. It may burn itself out, and that's what some of these viruses do. Eventually, when there's not enough hosts available, the virus just burns out. If we get that to that level of herd immunity, regardless of how we get there, whether it's through vaccination or people getting sick, then that's a potential reality. I do think that we did learn a lot of lessons from this, and many of them are really standard approaches. So what we've seen is the countries that have done the best have had a unified approach to this, regardless of where in the country they were applying it. And it's very challenging in a country as large as ours, with as many disparate government setups, as states all have specific powers reserved to them, for us to really give a unified response. And so really some thought has to go into if there is a future pandemic, whatever that looks like, whether that's a variant of coronavirus or something completely new down the road, how do we respond as a nation? And how do we respond together as a nation? And then how do we get information out? So hopefully social media, some legislation on social media will change, because I think, as Amy mentioned, the challenges have been people who get their news from social media, they get something from a responsible journalist, and the next piece of information they get is an opinion from somebody that's trending. And how do they discern between the two? And so do we put measures in place that allow for the government to say, listen, these are the sources of information, and stop all this misinformation from getting out there, because it was very harmful to our response. And having almost 500,000 people die from this, we will reach 500,000, there's no doubt. From this, it's unacceptable in a country that's as economically and medically as advanced as ours. It's unacceptable. It shows a lack of a unified response. It shows that we did not band together as well as we could have.
Well, you're right. We have to band together, certainly, especially when you hear those heartbreaking numbers that you just talked about, and get good, clear information and responsible information, responsible journalists. I feel like the role of journalists is more important than ever before. Dr. Sharma, first of all, thank you so much for all you do, and we'll be thinking of you and your team as we head forward to, as we battle this all together. Thank you so much. And Amy, thank you for the great research that the Pew Research Center always does, and to give us great perspective on this. And Reg, thank you for being one of those frontline journalists too, covering it and explaining it so well during this panel too. It's really been a pleasure to have all three of you here, and just such different experiences to really enlighten everybody. And I also want to make sure that we thank all of you at home. And we're so glad that you tuned in to the news conference, Real and Powerful, which has been sponsored by the Fair Media Council. I hope you find out more about the Fair Media Council, because they do so many incredible programs throughout the year, but especially this annual conference, which has just been, I feel like I learned so much in this last hour from our great three panelists. I hope all of you did too as well. It was really great to be with you all. Thank you so much. And make sure you check out also fairmediacouncil.org to get more details about this great conference, and also the terrific events that they do always throughout the year as well. This is Rita Cosby, and it's been great being with you. Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you.